Hi everyone, I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan and welcome to the Times of Israel's Behind the Headlines series. Today I'm joined by Natan, Sharansky and Gil Troy, who recently co-wrote the newly released book, Never Alone. Natan was a prisoner of Zion who spent 9 years in Soviet prisons fighting for the right to immigrate to Israel. He also spent 9 years in the halls of the Knesset and headed various ministries under 3 prime ministers. And most recently, he headed the Jewish Agency for 9 years. That serves as the shell of the book. During his so-called retirement, Natan can be seen speaking the world over. Gil has been a professor of history at Canada's McGill University. He has authored several books on Zionism and American presidential history, including about the Clintons, both Mr. and Mrs., and Reagan. In reading the book, you can easily see the wealth of context that Gil has added. Never Alone is a book of gratitude and great expectations. It's an inside look at top Israeli leaders, US and Russian leaders, and portrays them as the flawed individuals that they are. It is also a rallying cry to everyone to get involved and push for change. Constantly speaks about how the work of students and housewives freed Natan and how they pushed for great change in the Jewish world. It is the story of an immigrant who faced Sabra disdain and changed a system. And it is overall a call for unity in the face of rising anti-Semitism and broken communications among the Jewish peoples today. So what's interesting about the book, gentlemen, is that it's written as first person by Natan, but it is co-written. So how did that evolve? Gil, do you want to take that one?
Oh, sure. So look, we're a very unlikely duo. Natan was born in a town called Stalino in the heart of Soviet Russia at the peak of Soviet slavery, Soviet communism. I was born in Freedom in New York. I spent most of the 80s at Harvard studying history. He spent most of the 80s in the Gulag, living history, making history, being alone. I was surrounded by students. And we met in Jerusalem. And when we met, Natan said, I want you to be my co-author. And it was very clear from the start that we were writing partners. But we've got this amazing story, his life. I'm a boring academic. And so we use his life story, his stories to tell a broader picture. And the remarkable thing is that despite all our differences from background, despite all the disagreements we might have had over tone, style, logic, words, paragraphs, ideologically, we're really on the same page. And I'm very deeply moved. I actually wrote what you wrote down, what you said. It really is a book of gratitude because we both, coming from our different places, are very grateful to be living in this moment with all its challenges. We see all the good in it, and it is also a rallying cry. And it really is just a privilege to work with Natan, to learn from him, and occasionally to fight with him and always lose. Because the man who could outlast the KGB was definitely going to beat the professor every time.
So the book itself is in 3 sections. It's basically the early years through the imprisonment and freedom, and then the political life, and then the Jewish Agency onwards. Now, each of these could have been 3 books in their own right, each of these sections. And I wonder how you decided to take a life that is so remarkable over 7 decades and not to make a superficial recording of it, to make it a quick bite-sized read. You deal mostly in concepts versus chronology in the book. I mean, it is chronological. You go through the sections of the life, but it seems more focused on concepts than actually charting the existence of every day. Natan?
Yeah, well, I have to say it's not a biography. It's not a, because if it is a biography, then it's simply a shame that I don't mention many of those who are my main partners, main comrades in arms in fighting the Soviet system, and then creating the party and working on all parts of my life. And there are many more important episodes which are not mentioned at all, those which are mentioned. That is, in fact, all my years, from the moment I became Jewish activist, I was dealing with one thing, was in dialogue between Jews who are all over the world and Jews who are in Israel. And this dialogue of Jewish people which really filled my life, changed my life, gave me a lot of strength and confidence. But when you're having this dialogue and you don't see the big picture, you can be very depressed because there are so many disagreements. There are such deep feelings that the other side doesn't understand you, or that the other side betrays you, betrays your Jewish values, or betrays your Jewish state and so on. But if you look from different directions on this, as we are doing in this book, we are taking our Jewish dialogue between Israel and Jewish people and looking on it from the parish itself, when you really feel yourself connected to all the Jewish world, from the government, when you feel how it is important that the government will reach every Jew in the world, and from the point of Jewish agency, when it is clear for you as Jewish people how you can be made disappointed in many things, but you need Israel, otherwise you cannot survive. So we compare these three perspectives of the dialogue between Israel and Jewish people. And as I learned when I was learning drawing, that if you want to see the full subject, you have to look from three different perspectives. And that's what we are trying to do. We are trying to discuss, to present this dialogue between Israel and Jewish people as we met it in different points of our life.
It's partially a memoir and it's partially a manifesto. So I call it a memoir festo. You know, in writing, you're always told to show, not tell, right? We're both, Natan is an amazing storyteller. I'm a lecturer. So we could just, you know, lecture on and on, but we actually use the stories to try to make a broader point.
Which you so clearly do, and it's strangely updated, because on the one hand, we're talking about, you know, the very distant past of when you realized what is a Jew for the first time. And then on the other hand, we're talking about the coronavirus. One thing I wondered, you finished the book in April, I believe, and so you didn't have a chance to reflect upon what has been happening right now, including the so-called, or the quote-unquote peace treaty with the United Arab Emirates. And I wonder, as somebody who has served in the government, what are your feelings about this peace treaty?
Well, I think that is the real peace treaty. As I explained in the book a number of times and in other books too, I don't think that we had any peace process. Oslo was not a peace process, and disengagement definitely was not a peace process, because it was all about how to find a dictator among Palestinians who will help us to bring peace. And the first real agreement about normalization, which doesn't include any concessions to any dictator, which simply says that it is in our interest to coexist, to cooperate, and to help one another. I believe the meaning of it is huge. It's much bigger than the size of Abu Dhabi and Israel. The first time this old concept, which exists for 50 or 60 years in the Western world, especially in Europe, that we, the free world, have all these problems with Muslim world and specifically with the Arab world. We have all these waves of terror and so on, because Israel is not ready to give to Palestinians what they want them to give. And then, of course, but that is the concept. It can bring only more and more pressure on Israel, but cannot strengthen any really peaceful elements in the Arab world. So I do hope that this is only the first sign that this will continue. And really, it can be the beginning of real peace process. That's what I hope. Of course, we didn't write about it. After, and also we preferred to write about, when we are speaking about my own experience, what I saw myself, what I was involved myself. As my speculations are as good as anybody else about what happened in Abu Dhabi, but I'm very optimistic about it. I think it's huge achievement. People try to connect it with what happened with our unfortunate coalition government and what Bibi really wants and what Gantz wants. These are all the questions of the next couple of months. Here we are dealing with something which is changing paradigm of 50, 60 years.
But it also vindicates Natan's stand throughout his 9 years in the Israeli government, saying, unless you have normalization, unless you have people who really care about the people, you're not going to have peace. And when we see that the Palestinians immediately don't say, oh my goodness, there's peace in the world, and the Peace Now crowd doesn't say, wow, we've made one even small baby step forward toward peace, but no, if you're not following exactly the Palestinian hymnal, somehow it's not kosher, it's not acceptable, we're in trouble. And so I actually feel that, sure, I wish we had, the book had come out so we could work this in as a kind of the ultimate chapter.
No,
but
that's a different topic. No.
It's a different, but it shows. Right, we were ready to finish the book, but it really shows that, do you care about the people? Do you care about the people having peace? And a people-to-people peace is what you really need for resilience. And that was always Natan's vision when he was being told he was anti-peace, when he was told he's being too soft on the Palestinians. He was often told both those at the same time. We now see that what he was really talking about was a peace among, not the peace of the brave, but a peace among the peoples, a peace of normalization.
Excellent. Obviously, when you were being surveilled by the KGB, you had the feeling that the big brother, was watching you all the time. Today, under coronavirus, lahavdil, as we say in Israel, quite different situations, apples and oranges. There is increased surveillance of the citizenry, and there is a certain day that from the moment that you decide you want to take a coronavirus test, you are under surveillance. People know where you're going. Your phone is big brother watching you all the time. How do you feel about the new technology that we have that's today being used for the good and its uses in the future?
Look, Corona didn't bring this new technology in the world. Simply because of Corona, some of the new methods of monitoring, watching after people, which already exist, it became legitimate to publicize and to use them. So the fact that now it is general knowledge that you can be watched because of your mobile phone, I think it's a good thing that everybody will know what is the reality. Now, the fact that in non-democratic countries it's already used and very actively used for bad purposes is also known. By the way, I was telling a number of times that with all the retreat from democracy in Russia, it cannot be Soviet Union because there is no millions of people in Gulag and more knowledge of informers. And I was telling it until one really knowledgeable person told me a few years ago, you don't understand, today you don't need millions of informers. Today there are ways to know about meetings of the people, communication in a very different way than when they were sending 10 people to watch if they have contact with somebody else. So in general, the fact that we legitimized the usage of these things for good cause is good. But just because we legitimize it, it also gives opportunity to the public, to the Knesset, all of us, to watch very carefully when it has to be stopped and how it has to be under the control. The people say that it is bad that now it is openly used. I say, in fact, it is good that now we and members of Knesset know what is the potential, because the potential is already, for many years already, there is potential to, and not only potential, I think private firms are doing it, to watch carefully for every step of every citizen. And now that we know about it, I hope we will put very strict restrictions on the laws, the amendments, demands to every private firm and to everybody that it should not be used in normal situation to invade our life.
And do you have the faith that that will actually happen, or do you see this as a slippery slope reaching ever greater invasions into private citizens' lives?
You ask me? Well, look, it is existing anyway. It is existing. Simply, we didn't realize that it's existing, but it was existing already for 10 years, maybe more. And so I think it's good that now we are aware of it, and we have to try to put some public open restrictions to usage of this, that people who were using it now quietly would know that it is illegitimate. But you cannot stop the progress. You cannot stop development of the technologies. And these technologies appeared in the world not because we wanted to monitor the behavior of the people, but because simply we wanted to have a lot of free discussions, intense discussions. And that's what technology brought us to.
More than 100 years ago, Louis Brandeis, who is known in Israel as a great Zionist, but in America was a great progressive and a great Supreme Court justice, wrote this amazing essay about privacy. And you read it today and you go, it's unbelievable, because that's a time when technology was so much more primitive, so much more limited. And yet he saw that if you don't respect privacy, you have a serious problem in democracy. And he set up the tension between the power of the technology to violate the individual's privacy and to be used by the state, and the need to be vigilant to protect the individual. And so it's a constant balance, but I agree with Natan, you can't stop progress. You just have to have good breaks and a strong, resilient democracy to use the technology for good and not for ill.
So there's one area in Israel that seems to be using surveillance, perhaps not necessarily for the good of the people. And that would be, in my opinion, in the chief rabbinate, where we see cases of especially the Russian immigrants who have made Aliyah, immigrated to Israel, but aren't necessarily considered halachic Jews, or there's some doubt over their Judaism. And we hear increasingly about cases where people who have lived in Israel for 30 years, suddenly their Judaism is called under suspicion, and they're being scrutinized again, and even perhaps called non-Jews. I know there are something like 400,000 Jews who are not considered Jews who immigrated from Russia, currently living in Israel, who can't marry in the country. And there seems to be a system of surveillance on these people, or even just a prejudice against these people in terms of integrating into the society. Do you have any words of hope for these people who for generations have lived in Israel and are not considered Jews, even though in their hearts and perhaps in their practices as well they are?
That's a mixture of, let's say, prejudices, desire to keep political control from some bodies, and at the same time, I would say the power games. In order to show you that it's not only, the problem is not only chief rabbinate. I'll give you a simple example. There are at this moment approximately 700,000 former Russian Jews living in the United States of America. If you take child or even grandchild of those who came to the United States of America in 1995, and they grow, and she's growing in some Orthodox community of Bookstein or somebody else in New York, and then he and his friend, who was born from the parents who came, let's say, from Argentina, they decide to make Aliyah. The one who came, the American one, with the roots, let's say, from Argentina, simply needs note from his rabbi that in this community he lived together with parents, he had here bar mitzvah, he's Jewish. That's enough. For this guy whose grandparents came from Moscow, he has his documents will be sent to Lishkat Kesher, that we are special body who originally historical was dealing with the Soviet Jews, and they will have to check whether his parents or grandparents were really Jewish or not. And that's absolutely ridiculous. No chief rabbinate demands it. It's simply the power games. That was the authority of Lishkat Kesher, the Liaison Bureau 30 years ago, and because of some politicians, it remains up to this day. So there is a lot of it's not even prejudice, it's simply power games. In addition to this, no doubt, there is prejudices, and there is very rigid approach to what kind of conversion has to be recognized or not. In addition to this historical debate about recognition, non-recognition of non-Orthodox conversions, which goes back to Ben-Gurion, that was a compromise on which Ben-Gurion felt it would be easier to build the state. But in addition to this, at this moment, we have like a growing list of Orthodox rabbis, including some of the most Zionist rabbis, like Rav Lukstein or Rav Avivas and so on, that somebody in the chief rabbinate said that he does know them, and that's why their conversions should not be recognized for the citizenship. I have to say, it's maybe for the first time in Jewish history we have such a strange situation, that not the community, not the rabbi of the community is the one who decides what kind of conversion should define the Judaism of this person, but some quasi-political, quasi-religious bodies in the state. And there are reasons for this, because the state of Israel is built in the way in which no other state ever in history was built. There are no books how you are gathering exiles after thousands of years, and how you recognize them as citizens, and how you decide where there is the gul, the line. So in this book, in fact, as on any other issue, we try to show the arguments of both sides, because I was on both sides and I know these arguments. And so it's not the fight of the enemies, but that's the fight of people who are concerned how we are rebuilding our Jewish state and have different points. And we have to come to compromise. We have to come to agreements. We have to come to the station when Israel as a state embraces all the Jews of the world and not exiles them. So that's very painful, but extremely important question. And we spent quite a lot of time discussing it.
And your question zeroes in on what
optimistic. Of course, I'm optimistic. I'm always optimistic. We'll solve these problems. We'll solve the problem of the Kotel. We'll solve the problem of liberal approach to conversion. We'll solve, but better sooner than later.
Your question zeroes in on one of the central tensions of the book and the central tensions of Natan's life. Because as we go from the 9 years in prison, where he was solitary, but as we point out, never alone, because he knows the Jewish people were with him, but he was, spending day after day alone in a cell. All of a sudden, when he comes to Israel and he gets involved in politics, he sometimes stands alone too, as we talked about with the Palestinian issue, as you talked about with standing for democracy, but he also becomes a bridge builder. And that ability to shift from the stubbornness required to stand alone and stand up to the KGB, and the stubbornness required to be a bridge builder, to be a compromiser, to learn from both sides, to put up with both sides, and to try to find that shvil zahav, that middle path, that golden path of Maimonides, is one of the interesting things in the shift from being an outsider, the ultimate outsider, the dissident of dissident, the human rights activists, to being an insider, sitting at four cabinet, in four Israeli governments, always at the cabinet, always at the center of power. And that's insider, outsider. Sometimes you stand alone, and sometimes you build bridges together.
Another very common theme in the book, in all three of the sections, is the role of campuses, students in campuses. Now, when you're in prison, the students are represented as freedom fighters, those who are really taking to the streets and marching and really working hard to get you out. When you're in the government, we start to see a bit of a change, because those students who embraced you so readily begin to see you as the face of oppression now that you're representing the Israeli government. Is it a shift on campuses? Is it a shift in your own position in life? Is it both? And how are you perceived today now that you are not a politician and rather working for a unity, more focused on that?
Well, here are two different things. One thing, of course, is the change of my status. I am not a victim. I am not a fighter for the freedom of Soviet Jews, but I am Israeli politician and Israeli minister. So I'm responsible for good and bad things which the government is doing, or that thing that purity of struggle for Soviet Jewry, everybody could agree. It doesn't matter, it could be a French communist, or it could be the aristocrat from Britain, and they could agree about how good and noble is the cause of human rights, struggling for human rights in the Soviet Union and for the release of Soviet Union. Our cause as the people of the state, of course, it causes a lot of disagreements, and I would say that is natural. I had no remorse, no seconds thinking, moving from the life where everybody says you are such an inspiration to the life where everybody says you're such a disappointment. So that's the way to influence the world, to change the world. We write about it. The other thing is what happens with the young Jews on the campuses. And we are coming to this topic twice. First, when I am in the government and make my tour of the campuses at the time of Second Intifada, when we here in Israel feel that we are defending all the free world and losing hundreds of our citizens every month because of suicide bombings, and we launch counterattack against terror, and I'm in the government, in the important position. And at that very time, I hear how on one American campus and the others, or young Jews are saying to me, it will be better for us if Israel doesn't exist, because then we are not responsible for these awful things. Whether they happen or don't happen, I don't know. But the fact that I, here in the camp, is suspected that I am accomplice in genocide against Palestinians, that's awful for me. As a liberal Jew, I can't accept it. And suddenly you understand what a danger is not to our physical survival. We know how to fight with the help of our army, but to the unity of Jewish people, that we can lose big number of our people simply because our enemies are so successful in taking, hijacking ban of human rights from us and presenting us as the last ugly colonial project. And we know that it's not true. It's not a question how to persuade them that we are different, but how to make them feel proud for being part of the struggle of Jewish people and not being ashamed of it. So that was the big question. And then, of course, when I came back to this 10 years later as the head of Jewish Agency, and when it is so important to strengthen Jewish identity with the help of Israel, World Jewry discovered it. They want more birthright. They want more Mossad. They want more encounter with Israel because that's how they are guaranteeing that their children and grandchildren will be Jewish. And at that very time, there is bigger and bigger disbelief or distrust between liberal Jews and Israel, what is, of course, huge success of our enemies, but that's a huge challenge for us. And we are writing a lot about it.
I wonder though, and I'm asking you, Gil, as someone who's been on campuses for decades, you know, when I was a college student, I had green hair and I was a vegan and I protested circuses and things of that nature. And here I am today, you know, middle-aged mother of 6 living near Jerusalem. And I just wonder how permanent these ideologies are among the students, meaning could it just be a temporary, not lapse of judgment, but a temporary trying on this rebellious against their parents' or grandparents' love of Israel, and then eventually once they settle down, having that love restored to them, or is it not that at all? What do you think, Gil?
Well, when I was a college student, I had hair, so that was that also was a plus. Look, we used to think that. We used to think, this is a passing fancy. We used to think this is something where they come to campus and they want to practice being radical, and then they go to become lawyers and doctors and Indian chiefs and go mainstream. But what we're seeing in the last 5-7 years is that corporations are becoming woke, that this notion of the SJW, the social justice warrior, and by the way, Natan has spent his whole life, tzedek tzedek tirdof, justice, justice you shall pursue. I like to think I've done the same thing. We believe in justice, but when you talk about the social justice warrior, you talk about one particular reading, one particular approach, one particular interpretation of how to do things. And we've seen the bullying, and I think it's been intensified both by the polarization in the age of Trump and the shaming culture and the canceling culture that emerges with Twitter, where once upon a time it really was a kind of thing in the universities. Now the extremists are running the conversation, and they're bullying people on not just on Twitter, but also in the corporation called Twitter, not just on Facebook, but in the corporation called Facebook. And from there, it's going into even banks. I mean, I have friends who work in the most mainstream banks in New York, and they say that this bullying culture is really terrifying. And the saddest thing, I think, in the second part of the book is, look, there are, the rebels are sometimes annoying and sometimes infuriating. And, it is kind of so strange to have Natan Sharansky come to Brown University and have people yelling and screaming. And he actually terrifies his security guards by walking to these students and saying, let's talk. And they're yelling, Israel apartheid, Israel apartheid. He said, I was in South Africa during the elections. I met Nelson Mandela. Do you want to talk? And they don't want to talk. And they yell, down with Israel, down with Israel. That's one form of frustration. But what was really terrifying, what was really heartbreaking was here this man from the Soviet Union sees double-thinkers at Harvard University, at Columbia University, at Rutgers University, people at the best universities in the United States of America, in the freest country in the world that had always set the standard for freedom. And he sees in their eyes, I think one thing, I feel one thing, but I'll have to say a different thing in order to be accepted. And it started in the 2000s over Israel. And now we're starting to see it in 2020 over the United States of America, over race questions, over veganism, over all kinds of things. And again, post-book, we just recently, a week ago, saw a poll from the Cato Institute in Washington, which found that a majority of liberals and a majority of conservatives in the United States of America admit that in the last year or two, they check their opinions before they articulate them. They hide their opinions. And that is devastating for a democracy. And so, yes, the rebels are frustrating, but the double thinkers of today are truly terrifying because it's much more insidious. And I call it the increasingly silenced majority. And we have to make sure that it doesn't become a majority.
I want to strengthen this last point. No, it's a famous phrase, I think Elie Wiesel said, but and many others said it in different connections, that what starts with Jews doesn't finish with Jews. And the same thing about Israel. It started on the campuses 20 years ago that young students were afraid, and I give examples how they were talking, were afraid to express their views publicly because it will be bad for their career. And young postgraduate in business school in Harvard tells me, I wanted to sign this letter in support of Israel, but I knew that 3 of my professors, who are very important for my future, will not like it. And I preferred not to say it publicly. And I was furious because this type of doublethink in Moscow University, in our times, that was natural. But here, today, it's not about Israel. It's not about Zionism. It's people, there are more people, people told me in San Francisco, we voted for Trump, but we keep it a top secret because we'll be thrown away from our community. And then you find out some very liberal people who say, I like the slogan, Black Lives Matter, but I don't like this organization. But if I say it publicly in my organization, my career will be in danger. And about many things which are today, yesterday was politically correct, today it's not politically correct, and people are afraid to discuss it because it can undermine their promotion, or it can, and that's all developed in the last 10, 50 years. And it all started from the fact, at least in my life, it started from the fact that you start meeting people who are afraid to say publicly what they feel about Israel, because Israel becomes, from the post child and the beloved child, becomes a problematic colonial project. And now you can see it with many other things which have nothing to do with Jews and nothing to do with Israel. It's a very dangerous phenomena of doublethink entering free vote. And here everything depends from every citizen. Every citizen has to decide for herself or himself, is he ready to become a doublethink? And it's up to us to be free people or not.
In one of my last conversations with my teacher, Elie Wiesel, he said, I just can't believe that I lived long enough to see anti-Semitism come back. And when I sit with Natan Sharansky and I'm watching through his eyes and through my eyes, doublethink spread and this bullying culture and this cancel culture spread in the United States of America. And let's point out, it's not coming from the top. It's not coming from the government, right? You still can go and denounce the United States of America on Twitter and on and in the town square, but it's coming, as Natan says, from employers. It's coming from fellow students. It's coming from professors. It's truly terrifying and outrageous. And let's be very clear: the world is round, and the left and the right are meeting, because there's a culture of intolerance on the left, and there's a culture of intolerance on the right, and that bullying culture overlaps. And the people in the middle. I echo what Natan says. You've just got to grow a spine. You've got to be willing to stand up, and first of all, occasionally talk to somebody with whom you disagree, and not just talk to them, but listen to them. And secondly, you also need to sometimes say, you know what, I agree with you on 80%, but not 100%. And that's free thought, and that's critical thought. And I'm sorry to say, I'm seeing it not just at the universities, I'm now starting to see it in the high schools. I'm starting to see it creep into the elementary schools. And I'm starting to see it not just in the public schools, but in the Jewish day schools. And if we can't create bubbles of resistance and bubbles of free thought in our own communal institutions, then we're just shooting ourselves in the foot.
Very depressing, hearing what you're saying.
But guys, I'm optimistic with the nature of people. People want to be free, and there is no totalitarian regime which will turn people into non-free. But even the small concessions here, by individual concessions, are dangerous. We are simply warning. We are
it's warning signals.
I definitely believe. I was optimistic in prison. I'm definitely optimistic in Jerusalem.
And I always quote Ben Gurion and Golda Meir, both of them, who said you can't be a Zionist and a pessimist. So I'm a Zionist, so I have to be an optimist. And that's also like one of the themes of the book is the excitement that Natan and Avital have when they discover Israel, when they rediscover each other after 12 years. And it's kind of like a Rip Van Winkle thing almost, like first of all, being cut off from freedom and cut off from technology. He comes back into into February 1986, the world, but also the excitement of Israel. And one of the characters in the book is Israel and is Jerusalem, and the true inspiration day to day with all our frustrations and all our problems of living here in this Jewish democracy is one of the things that bonds the two of us, but also hopefully will excite the readers to see that for all our frustrations, we do have a lot of beautiful, beautiful flowers growing in our Jewish democratic garden.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. I moved here myself 21 years ago. A few years ago, I read a very troubling interview between a Forward editor and then Diaspora Minister Naftali Bennett. And it just seemed like these two people were speaking in parallel. They were both using the English language, but any concept that one raised, the other couldn't understand, and vice versa. How do you propose to overcome such a huge disconnect in terms of mere understanding of conceptual things that make up Israel and the Jewish peoplehood, as illustrated in this particular article, but we see it every day over so many issues such as the Western Wall plan that didn't come to fruition, the conversion bill that's always looming here, and that's only on the Israeli side. What is your rallying cry here?
Well, first of all, we try in our book always to show both sides and to be fair to both sides. So if one side feels that it is not understood or it's betrayed, the other side has no less serious reasons to feel that it is not understood and it is betrayed. And it all goes to the fact that half of Jews who live today in the world chose to live in Jewish state in the Middle East, and half, approximately, chose to live as a minority in liberal society in the free world. And these are very different choices. Both sides want to be part of Jewish family, both sides want to feel that it is our history and we have mutual future, and we share a lot of values. But both sides, the moment you chose that is your physical life, you have different sets of priorities. Number one priority for Israelis always will be physical survival. We have to make sure that nobody can destroy us. That's number one priority. Number one priority for the survival of Jewish community or minority in the United States of America is to make sure that society is liberal and tolerant, that we can survive here as Jews. Not similar. If you are not interested in our identity, if you want to assimilate, then it's different set of priorities. But for everyone for whom it is important to stay Jewish, it is very important to keep society very tolerant and very open to this minority. And from
in
here,
the book, you discuss them as the line of David versus the line of Isaiah.
Yeah. But from this you can find out how, for one side, it is really number one priority, that how it can be that if Israel my home, I cannot come here with my rabbi, with my prayers and pray near the Kotel. And for the other side, it is if we all agree that for our security, this agreement with Iran is such a big danger, and here left and right, everybody agrees it is a big danger, how it is that you American Jews, only in order to be nice to your president, you support this. And it seems that both of them are not solved. They can be solved easily. Simply, we have to understand that we are living in different environments, we have different priorities, but we have something mutual and common. Let us discuss, let us talk, let the other side understand why, from where all this strange thing of status quo between religion and state came, and what we can afford to do and what we cannot afford to do. And then maybe we'll find out that there are more things that we can afford to do, but the other side will understand that there are limits because we have society to build. On the other hand, maybe if we will be much more open and much more involved with the other side in our security problems, then not because of propaganda, but because of, look, our people from the Meretz are in the Knesset, sitting in the closed part of the security committee and are discussing and agreeing with many things, which simply if you are discussing it in the press with the Amnesty International, you cannot explain. But so we have to talk in a much more deep, intimate way with one another than we talk if you want to continue to be one family. And to accept that, yes, at the same time, we'll have sometimes very different worldviews and sets of priorities, but we'll find how to live, how to continue our path together with all these differences. And so, in fact, that's, I would say, the main message of our book. We will stay being different, but because our desire to continue our journey in history is so strong, through talking, through discussions, through cooperating, we can build it.
We use the language of Isaiah and Davidian to help name the difference and to help talk about what we call the points of divergence. But we also constantly emphasize the convergence. And think of it, the Times of Israel runs headlines constantly about the points of divergence. But the enterprise itself of the Times of Israel is an extraordinary Israel diaspora partnership. It's an extraordinary force that puts many Israelis and diaspora Jews not just working together, but also having a common language. And we tend to emphasize all the points of disagreement, and we forget all the things that link us together. Even the Kotel. At the very day that I was sitting with Natan, and we had already started writing the book, and he was so upset by Bibi Netanyahu's betrayal and blowing up of the deal, that very night, my son goes to the shuk, back when you could go to Machane Yehuda, and he says, I can't find a seat. And I know why he can't find a seat. I say, why? He says, because there are all the birthright kids and all the Massa kids and all the American kids who were sitting there hanging out in Jerusalem. So at the very time that all the headlines are saying, rupture, divorce, there's never been such a great gap, we have this extraordinary program, which Natan helped found, which has brought over 700,000 people. And once upon a time, only 25% of American Jewry had visited Israel. And now, pre-corona, nearly 50% had visited Israel. So we see the trends and we see the issues that get us yelling and screaming and pulling our hair out. But we also see the underlying desire that we don't want to give up on our watch. We don't want the Jewish people to fall apart on our watch. And that's why we call the book Never Alone, because whoever you are, wherever you are, when you're part of the Jewish people, you're never alone. You're part of this amazing network. You're part of these extraordinary values. You're part of this amazing story, but you're also part of this group of people who will look out for you, who will care for you, and will prop you up if you need. And even when you don't.
And now 100% of American Jews are zooming to Israel.
Right.
Maybe this new weapon, I didn't know the existence of Zoom half a year ago. Maybe that what will help us to talk more.
Okay, I wish much discussion among all sectors of Jewish society, all ranks, leadership, grassroots people, and perhaps, yes, the Zoom connection can be the one that makes it happen. Thank you so much for all your time, and really a pleasure reading the book. I highly recommend it to everyone. I learned so much, and thank you.
I didn't hear you. Could you say that louder?
I highly recommend it.
Yeah, you can zoom it.
Right.
Okay, dear friends.
Thank you very much.
A lot of health.
Thank you.
Thanks for the careful reading and the nice words. So.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.